wanted to pay people like yourselves to come and talk and pay for your time and be able to cover travel and provide accommodation, and that's where the size of the work really expands, because that meant applying for funding pots, relying on generosity all in your own time. And then also like the skills needed are to seek out and develop that infrastructure framework for us, also given the time to go out and bring the tools needed in, which is learning about the difference between a sponsorship and a partnership and a funding. Because even now it's not 100% clear. And I really struggle with, like, because again this is an annual once a year event, which is volunteer run, so the challenges that come with, like, we need to make sure we do it. If we can't do it properly, then maybe we need to ask ourselves, should we do it at all? And also things that you touched about on before was like volunteerism, and that's something I feel that's quite I've fallen victim to, because I didn't know how else to do it. So I myself have over volunteered, and then also relied maybe too much on volunteering. But what I think is a grassroots volunteer project from literally the ground up, to try to start introducing paid roles, but again create more.
It's more administration work, isn't it?
And that's why I joke to people, you know, running an event is 90% administration and 10% imagination, like, because it's mostly admin. It's mostly admin, no one can do it.
I could well believe that, and I guess within the trade union movement is the biggest volunteer organisation. It relies on volunteers, it relies on those people on the ground doing things, otherwise things don't change.
So the time you spend as an artist writing a grant application, no one's paying for that time. You're lucky if you get paid for your research.
Just get brought up with regularly with arts council. I don't know if anybody went to the, I forgot what they were called now, but the arts council early in April, May, I think it was, May, June, organised a whole series of online talks and events. Passed a lot of people over, which were looking at artists' conditions. And you know, I went to just one seminar, I think, which was really looking at that, and it had different speakers, and it was really interesting. But it just gets to a point where it's going, right, well, we all know this, and what are we going to do to change it? You know, things have to change, because we're not going to get any diversity within our sector, and if anything, it's going to get worse within our sector, because people they're not in that privileged position to basically do the internships for free, to, you know, do exhibitions for free.
Especially with the current social and political climate as well. After I've done a lot of this in my job recently, it's reminding people, look, we don't live in New Labour Britain anymore. You don't get 78 quid a week being employed anymore. The government expects you to drain your finances first. We have a benefit cap which crunches people. Now we've got also a cost of living crisis. If you want people to give their time for free, you've got to cover basic things like food and travel. You've got to offer that as a basic. It's not like you can cover it like you did in the past. If you 78 quid, we lived at home with mum, could help cover your phone bill and your travel during the week to build up your resume so you can become unemployed. And that kind of reflecting that, like, the reality of our world now is something I'm very surprised that I'm still doing. I'm very surprised I'm like sharing that with senior people. And also the expectation of like expecting folk to volunteer so much is debilitating. Like, we started back with Salvation Heritage Month. We were constantly told how great we were. It didn't lead to more money. It didn't lead to the support, kind of support we needed. And it didn't, and that was really confusing to see. People keep telling us, oh, it's so great, this can go such a long way, we can't believe you've done it as volunteers. Well, that's great, but what are you bringing me? And so we need to advise, that's not what I need. I need a finance officer. I don't need money for a finance officer because you give me £1,000. I spent that mostly on Zoom, on paying artists.
It's nothing, isn't
so
it?
like, I think there was the online festival that ran on like 2.5, 3 grand maybe. But it was stuff like that, and the majority of the money just went on paying artists and paying for like tools and technologies. The expectation as part of grant funding across like the Bradford landscape, it does seem to currently there is an unset expectation. You're going to be expected to volunteer time, and that volunteerism won't be said down where it says volunteer hours. It's the word in kind or matched funding, and people think, oh, that means that that's something else, like a room or a resource. Like, no, you can give your time as in kind, and a lot of people do. And you'll say X amount of hours would normally be waged as like £15 an hour. I will give like X amount of my time for free, and it's not sustainable either. Because, like you say, when you want to bring in new people, people from non-traditional backgrounds who wouldn't have gone and done an arts degree.
I think that's going to be something.
They're not coming. They're not coming. We are not coming. I'm not coming.
Yeah.
Like, unless you're covering transport, you're covering food,
Yeah.
you're covering accommodation, and those packages are there. And that's part of the reason why we applied for funding this year, was because we would just be able to offer people who wouldn't normally be able to do a stall waiver, cover your transport, and try to put you up for the night as well. And trying to offer that as a way to empower people to attend. Because while Zine fairs are this democratic space and this diverse space, it's not by accident. So even this Zine fair has been engineered to be representative, and where I'm still struggling to find that right representation and bring it into the space. Like, I think there's this mythos that things magically happen, like people magically show up, and no, like we try to remove barriers as much as possible and bring in people who wouldn't normally get the chance.
And it's on Arts Council's agenda, isn't it? They're saying, they've done their reports where they're saying they want more diversity in the sector, but they really have to show willing. On the Good Practice Charter, when we've been launching it, we've done online training with creative and cultural skills, and they're a really interesting organisation because they explain it so well what a freelancer is and what a volunteer is, and the legal differences, because it sometimes gets a little bit muddy with some arts organisations. And then the other thing, thinking about how there'll be less working class people going off to university to do fine art because
the message don't want you to. They don't want you to be useful.
They don't want you to be useful. They don't want you to question things, because just some of the things I've touched on, if you think of those beautiful Durham Miners banners, it's using visual art and culture to educate people. It's another alternative form of education. So I think within our sector we need to see how working class people can become a union member of Arts Union England. We need to make sure it doesn't become elitist and just have people who've got degrees. We need to make sure that there is provision available for working class people to say where the studios I am, to get a studio there, because they're maybe not going to come the traditional route.
Democratising that knowledge and getting that information to people is a challenge a lot to come across. Because it's really hard to do, because the cultural landscape in every region will be different, and those needs will be different. You can't take a toolkit and just hand it out and say, here you go, use these tools, go find your people. Anyone could do it, because it's so site specific in that sense of based on where you are, you will meet X amount of people, and their needs will differ completely to like across the border.
Something you were saying before about the cost of living crisis as well, and I've been thinking about it for a while, is it's going to get harder and harder for people. Council budgets are going to get smaller. How do we justify from our part of the sector council spending money on culture, like keeping libraries open, keeping people in jobs, compared to say children's centres?
They'll be the warm spaces, won't they? The library, the museum, any open public space that's warm will be the space people go to spend their time to avoid going on putting the heating on. I think, and people will be accessing those spaces more so for that purpose. Like,
I mean, I know when I speak to other trade unions, I often point to like how people coped in lockdown, and how they turned to creative things, to do suddenly either having time to do things that they wouldn't normally do, or doing things because they knew it would help their mental health. They knew by by getting out and doing some gardening, or going for walks, or just enjoying that kind of space to be creative. I just feel like we need to be, I'm conscious that I produce my culture. I'm really privileged to be able to do that because I've got the finances, because I've got a job, I've got a studio, and I'm in that kind of creative space. I can do that. But I don't want to be the person who's dictating what kind of cultural experiences people have. I think that should also be down to people in the cities, whether it's Bradford or Newcastle or Gateshead. And I think trade unions have got a role to play in that, particularly because we're part of Arts Union England's tiny, but it's part of this big trade union family.
I think you think, sorry to interrupt,
No,
the memorandum you mentioned before, I know the first time I'd heard of that sounded quite exciting. You mentioned Leeds 2023 have one. I'm wondering, how does it work and how is it implemented?
Yeah, so the memorandum of understanding that we formulated that with Yorkshire and Humber TUC. So that was within Yorkshire and Humber TUC, they have different working groups, and this was the Culture and Leisure Industry Committee. And it was a lot of time meeting with Leeds 2023, talking to the staff, drawing up a draft, passing it back and forwards. But it was influenced by what happened in Leicester and the TUC down there. They'd agreed there. So what you were saying regionally, how things are different regionally, and that's reflected also within the trade unions as well. So they'll have sort of, I found that Equity have got a good strong presence in the Yorkshire and Humber area. So I think what it starts off as is the trade unions meeting, those representatives, whether they're volunteers or paid officials, meeting together and saying, okay, we've got Bradford 2025 coming up. How do we make sure that the people of Bradford, get the cultural delivery that they want? People who are working within it get paid properly. You've got things in place so you're not having discrimination. People are treated fairly. You're not going to be exploiting people. So if I lived in Bradford, I think the first thing I would do is probably go to my trades council and bring it up at my trades council meeting, bring it up at my local branch meeting if I was in a trade union, and say, and it doesn't have to be the creative unions, it's anyone who enjoys culture basically. You could bring it up at Unite Unison meeting.